3 minutes after 10 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where, well, it might not happen, of course. It is simply a request for the International Criminal Court to issue a warrant for the arrests of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Defense Minister, three leaders of Hamas, Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Minister, three leaders of Hamas. Well, how are we going to talk about this? I can tell you what the reaction will be in some quarters, most notably the Israeli government, and I think perhaps inevitably the White House as well. It will be to claim that this is a grotesque overreach, or that this is unreasonable, this is unacceptable. And yet the momentum for some time now has felt unstoppable, hasn't it? The sense that Israel had shifted from reasonable response to the atrocities of October the 7th into something very different, something very dark, has become, for all, I think, but the most committed supporters of Likud and Netanyahu himself, or at least of Netanyahu's coalition, the sense that things had veered into profoundly unpleasant territory had become increasingly irresistible. So you have people like Chuck Schumer in America using the word pariah. You have people all over the world effectively calling for ceasefire, or calling at least for more to be done to ensure that aid can get into the territory. You have a death toll that, whichever way you dice it, you have a death toll that will be far in excess of the murders of October the 7th when the dust finally settles on this. And you have an unconscionable number of children already dead. And of course, it's far from over. So I know what the knee-jerk reactions will be from the other side as well. It will be that Israel is an apartheid state, and Israel is genocidal, and Israel is all of the above, and embarked upon ethnic cleansing. The truth surely has to lie somewhere between those two poles, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Not for the first time since October the 7th. I find myself reminded of the absolute importance of trying to steer a course of objectivity, trying to conduct a conversation in a way that doesn't immediately become allied to or apologist for either Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government or people who are comfortable with or not sufficiently outraged by the actions of Hamas. The way in which I've managed to do this previously, of course, is to refuse quite violently to feel more about the death of an Israeli child or a Jewish child than I do about a Palestinian child or a Muslim child. And that, of course, extends all the way through to adults, well, certainly through to all non-combatants. And even if you were to simply employ that statistical measure, you would run the risk of upsetting one, quote, side, end quotes. You have people on both sides, I suppose, but most vocally supporters of Israel insisting that there are no innocent people in Gaza, that everybody is somehow responsible for the actions of Hamas. You have calls for a form of repatriation, for people to be offered, in quotes, the opportunity to leave the war zone. And so, and finally, you have some clear blue water between the two main political parties in London. David Lammy, the shadow foreign secretary, saying that the UK and all parties to the Rome Statute have a legal obligation to comply with warrants. Warrants, of course, that may not be issued, but I think, judging by the fear, the public panic of Benjamin Netanyahu, the fear there is clearly that they will be. It means that of the 122 countries, I think, that are signatories to that statute, Netanyahu wouldn't be able to visit any of them without running the risk of arrest, technically including the United Kingdom, which makes it slightly odd that the Prime Minister's spokesman is talking about the ICC not having jurisdiction in this case, and most importantly, claiming that the action does nothing to help reach a pause in the fighting. So simultaneously calling for a pause in the fighting while not recognising the depiction of the senior prosecutor at the International Court. They even quote Suella Braverman in some newspapers, which I increasingly think is not really helpful to anybody. Suella Braverman says the ICC's decision to issue arrest warrants against Israeli leaders is a disgrace. Why is it a disgrace? They are not, under the readings of what is being alleged, by any stretch of the imagination, legitimate Israeli defensive measures. You know, that's what you do, isn't it? In court cases, you examine the evidence and arrive at objective conclusions. So all you can do now is claim that they're biased. Otherwise, you would simply say, if I was Benjamin Netanyahu, I would say today, I welcome the opportunity to prove beyond reasonable doubt that I have no case to answer. I welcome the opportunity to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Israel has not committed any war crimes. And I look forward to seeing the leaders of Hamas held responsible for the atrocities which they have committed. And, of course, what Israel stands accused of is grim, you know, the starvation element of it. There were warnings in some of the earlier judgments about what might happen if every effort was not made to ensure that aid made its way into Gaza. And yet we have seen footage of Israeli activists trying to prevent aid from getting into Gaza. Don't forget also that outside the United Kingdom and the United States, the situation looks to most people a lot less nuanced. The pursuit of alleged war crimes is usually, objectively, a fairly clear good thing for the international community to undertake. But once again, Benjamin Netanyahu, in his desperate attempts to save his own skin, is setting fire to international norms. So how do we talk about it? How do we talk about this? I don't know, is the short answer, because, as I say, rather than saying I welcome the opportunity to allow international experts to examine what has actually gone on, and I'm afraid that in brackets after that I have to add that Israel won't allow international observers or journalists into the region, and you can answer that question yourself, but you're going to struggle to come up with a reason that paints Netanyahu's government in a positive light. Why would you not want this opportunity to prove to the world that you haven't done any of the things that you're accused of? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Why would you not welcome the opportunity? Why would you reach immediately for claims that everybody from the United Nations down is biased? One of the allegations is that Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, have been using starvation as a weapon and directing attacks against civilians, among other alleged offences. Well, you know, invite them in and prove them wrong. I imagine, given the access that we have to the events of October the 7th, a heck of a lot easier to prove the allegations being made against the leaders of Hamas. But I felt from the very beginning of this that any claim Israel had to the moral high ground would only be sustainable by transparency and accountability. And it seems now that a fighting force that likes to describe itself as the most moral army in the world is denying both accountability and transparency. I realised some time ago that the line, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, is unhelpful in many contexts, but every now and then it hoves back into view, doesn't it? It hoves back into view. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. It should be relatively easy to prove that you haven't used starvation as a weapon, that you haven't directed attacks against civilians, that you haven't done any of the things of which you are accused, just as Hamas leaders now are required to try, and good luck with that, lads, to prove that they hadn't undertaken mass murder, they hadn't taken hostages, and they hadn't sanctioned the use of rape and other acts of sexual violence as crimes against humanity. And that, I think, is where Joe Biden comes into it. Joe Biden, I think, and you may know more about this than I do, Joe Biden is politically hidebound, I think, to come out in favour of arrest warrants being issued against one of his closest allies would be a political impossibility, politically impossible to contemplate. And yet the rest of the world, well, certainly the 122 signatories, find themselves legally bound in the event of an arrest warrant being issued to enact its consequences, up to and including the possible arrest of a former ally or a current ally should he ever set foot on British soil. So what would you like to say about this? What would you like to contribute to this conversation? It's 124 state members of the ICC who would be under obligation to arrest. It's unlikely that the Hamas leaders are going to be leaving their hideouts anytime soon. But the leader of a democratic country and the defense minister of a democratically elected government would be under pressure. Well, would be required. They would be under obligation to arrest them simply in the event of the warrants being issued. Even non-members would come under pressure to carry out an arrest. If you're as enormous as America, you could resist that pressure. Same with Russia and China, which are also non-signatories. I can't imagine that Netanyahu would be prevented from visiting America, and similarly, the Hamas leaders would probably be safe in Qatar, which isn't a member of the ICC either. But the words of Biden that come into view today the most, I choose my words quite carefully here, because the question of moral equivalence between Netanyahu's government, not the Israeli state, but Netanyahu's government and the Hamas leadership has, with every passing month, become a thornier issue to contemplate. I mean, how many children have to die before you will speak about the events in Gaza with the same sense of horror and disgust that you speak about the events in Israel on October the 7th? For many, many people, that point was passed long, long ago. And so to separate the people of Gaza, the Palestinian people, from Hamas leaders and Hamas combatants, and to separate the people of Israel, the state of Israel, from Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant and that coalition government, which also, of course, includes people who've called for nuclear bombs to be dropped on the Gaza Strip, who've insisted that Israel has every right to every yard of land in that territory, to coin a phrase that gets you into enormous trouble if you say it from one side of the argument, but no trouble at all if you say it from the other, from the river to the sea. It's a Likud policy statement, but if you stick it on a banner while marching through London, if Suella Braverman was still Home Secretary, you'd run a very real risk of being locked up. So the resistance to any conversation that says people who do wrong, whichever side they're on, should be treated with equal weight, equal force of the law, remains considerable. And yet, if you are accused of war crimes, surely you would, if you haven't committed any, relish the opportunity to exonerate yourself. It's an odd one. I'm going to open up Idiot's Corner this morning. Someone called Matthew Millett has been in touch saying, when is James doing a show on the Congo? Well, when the Congo has a government that is a committed and sworn ally of my government in the United Kingdom, Matthew. I'd have thought that, even in words of one syllable, that was fairly easy to grasp. But that's an example of what we talked about earlier, the knee-jerk reaction of people who want to remain supportive of Benjamin Netanyahu but can't answer the question of why wouldn't you want your people, side, allies to avail themselves of the opportunity to prove that they haven't committed the war crimes of which they are accused. Come at this from whatever angle you want. Try, if you can, to keep it fair, but it's obviously a hugely emotive issue. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. If you want to take a step back from the events of the last 24 hours and look at the bigger picture, the question I'd ask is, what does this change? What does this change? I think Joe Biden, when he rejects the idea of any conflation of the Israeli government with the Hamas leadership, actually, and possibly unintentionally, highlights the biggest problem that Israel face, is that the world is watching, and increasingly, I sense, struggling to understand how one side is somehow permitted to behave in the way that Israel continues to behave, while the other side is, since pretty much the middle of October, suffering death and destruction on an apocalyptic scale. So what does this change? 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. And if you don't want me to read your name out on the radio, don't put it on your messages. Again, I can't believe that I have to explain that to somebody who is presumably allowed to use scissors. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need to tell me, A, how you respond to the ICC's move, call for arrest warrants to be issued against Benjamin Netanyahu, Yahya Sinwar, and three others. And secondly, what does this change in terms of the bigger picture? All right? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. It's 10:21. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If the arrest warrants are issued, what will that mean for those charged? Very simply, 124 countries would be obligated to arrest any of the five men in the event of them setting foot on their soil. So, why? I mean, the big question of what this changes is one that you're welcome to answer already, 0345 6060973. But I think the one I really want to dig into is why Israel wouldn't welcome the opportunity to refute these allegations, to prove that they haven't done any of the things that they are accused of. Why reach immediately for claims of bias and claims of conspiracy? Manny's in, unless, of course, there is a bias and there is a conspiracy, in which case you're welcome to explain it to me. Manny's in Barnet. Manny, what would you like to say?
James, good morning. First of all, I'd just like to say I think it's excellent the way you've sort of summarized the hypocrisy of what's going on between Israel and the Palestinians' plight. As for the international court's warrant, I think it's absolutely correct that morons like Benjamin Netanyahu must be held accountable for their war crimes and genocide.
Well, alleged war crimes and alleged genocide. I mean, they haven't even issued an arrest warrant yet. So I mean, I've asked fairly clear questions. I grant you, not the clearest questions I've ever asked, but fairly clear questions about why you would reach immediately for the rejection of the jurisdiction of the court or the rejection of the rights of the prosecutor to pursue these warrants and the bigger picture of what it actually changes. But the whole point, really, Manny, of having investigations and of having trials and of having arrests and prosecutions is to establish whether or not any of the things alleged have actually taken place. So for you to come on the radio as the first caller and speak as if it has already been proven is arguably unhelpful.
No, what I'm about to say is that you're absolutely right, that it should be open up for investigation. And the only reason you would refuse such investigation is when you know that you are guilty, you've got something to hide, because if you didn't, you'd be more than happy to clear your name. I mean, you know, it's high time now that people like Biden and Suella Braverman should shut up and just go and clear off. To be honest with you, I think people like Michael Goldrow...
The President of the United States of America can't really shut up and clear off.
They can, but when he comes up with gibberish...
To be replaced by Donald Trump, which I don't know would be good for anybody, frankly.
I agree it's not sort of helpful to replace one idiot with another idiot, but you can't take American administration seriously when it comes to Israel because they've given them unconditional support for decades. And now we've got a monster of Israeli state government and led by Benjamin Netanyahu that no one seems to control. Even America now are struggling to contain him. You know, on one hand they're saying we won't supply you with weapons so that you can carry on with the genocide of the Rafah.
Again, you've used the word genocide again, which makes a mockery of this entire conversation because it's about whether or not the allegations should be properly prosecuted and investigated. But you see, you've already made your mind up, Manny, while calling everybody else an idiot.
I think, we're all entitled to our opinion from what we've seen on our screens for the last 8 months.
You're entitled to an opinion, but if you've already decided what the verdict is, I'm not sure you're really entitled to make a contribution to a conversation about the importance of a legal process, are you, pal?
I'm more than happy to act as an individual citizen and happy to arrest.
I'm just saying we're having a conversation about the importance of a legal process, at which you consider to be pointless because you've already decided what the verdict would be, which is fine. I mean, you're absolutely right. That's freedom of speech. That's your prerogative, or whatever word you want to say. But you might want to think twice about labelling everybody else involved in the conversation as an idiot if you fail to grasp something as simple as the fact that if you're already judge, jury, and executioner, then you're kind of on the side of people who don't think there is any need for a legal process. So unintentionally, you've ended up on the same side of it as the Israeli government. Balama is in Lambeth. Balama, what is going on?
Hi, James. Great question. I mean,
well, I don't think I'm going to win a Pulitzer Prize for what is going on, Balama, but you're very kind. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, James, I wanted to start by saying I think asking Netanyahu to go to the International Criminal Court and clear his name would be asking a lot of him. It is asking too much of him. remember that when Israeli courts wanted to hold him responsible or prosecute him for corruption, he tried to undermine the whole system by reforming the system and dismantling the court's jurisdiction, essentially, to try him. And if he could do that in his own country, then, asking him to go to the International Criminal Court is clearly something he wouldn't do, because we know he had something to hide.
So
and
what happened? In some ways, we're jumping ahead of ourselves, because this would be, in the events of the warrants being issued, it would be, the very first time that the International Criminal Court had sought to hold a close ally of the West and of America in particular to account. So there comes a point where continuing support for Benjamin Netanyahu involves quite a severe, not existential, but certainly very powerful threat to the supranational institutions upon which we all rely for a semblance of security. No, or not?
Yeah, that's right. And, one of the criticisms against the International Criminal Court has been that it was almost meant for African leaders, that whoever is prosecuted are people from the developing world, and no one from the West or an ally of the West had ever been prosecuted in the court. And I think this is one of the things that will change, to your question as to what would change. But unfortunately, Western politicians, when it comes to this crisis, James, used to apply double standards, but now they don't have any standards. Because whenever Israel does something that is against the law, they claim to not know. Remember when James Cleverly was asked a few days after the siege of Gaza, after water and electricity was cut, he was asked and he said, "I am not a lawyer," as if there were no lawyers in the Home Office.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So, this is, I suppose, where we come back to the words of the Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan, isn't it? Where he says, "Today we once again underline that international law and the laws of armed conflict apply to all." So, I know this is more your field of expertise than mine by a huge chalk, Bulama. But if Benjamin Netanyahu is somehow permitted to treat the court with contempt, what happens when the next African potentate who falls foul of the International Criminal Court is called to order by the chief prosecutor? I almost hesitate to think what's at stake here, what could be undermined here.
Yeah, they could easily say, and it is not just Netanyahu, it is Netanyahu, but also President Biden supporting him and Rishi Sunak supporting him. Yes. You could see that less than an hour after the warrant was issued, they did not wait for any opinion from any lawyer. Number 10 put out a statement, and White House put out a statement. And when we said stop selling arms to Israel because they are killing civilians, they said they were waiting for legal opinions, and then later they said they were supported by the legal opinion to continue, and they wouldn't publish the legal opinion. But in this one, they don't need to wait for any legal opinion. And the more the West continues these kinds of double standard or no standards, then tyrants and oppressors across the world would continue to oppress their people, and they would violate the law, including international law, and nobody has any moral authority to tell anyone that what you are doing is wrong, including Russia, for example, what it is doing in Ukraine.
Because there are arrest warrants out for Putin already, aren't there? On the specific case of kidnapping children from Ukraine and taking them to Russia.
Yeah, and presumably they support that. And I think by the end of this, James, if the International Criminal Court issues this warrant, then I think number 10 and White House would support the part of the warrant that calls for Hamas leaders to be arrested, and then the second part for Netanyahu and his minister, they would ignore that. And I think that's terrifying. Of hypocrisy.
Well, it's worse than hypocrisy, isn't it? Because it undermines the institution. So I saw this during Brexit, and I don't expect any prizes for managing to bring Brexit into this conversation, but it was the first time as a citizen of a relatively peaceable country that still had faith in the rule of law that I saw media and politicians essentially prioritise judgments over justice. So that front page of the Daily Mail, enemies of the people, haunts me, because that was a moment in my own life where the country in which I live and the profession in which I work sought to attack the independence of the judiciary because it didn't like a judgment. And I see echoes, well, not even echoes, I see a fairly crystal clear reflection of that in what is going on now with reference, as you say, to Biden and to Sunak. They are saying, I don't care about justice, or at least I don't care about the judicial institution, in this case the International Criminal Court. I don't care about the treaties that uphold its right to pronounce upon matters of international law, specifically in the context of war crimes, because they have done something I don't like, because it is embarrassing for my friend stroke ally. Therefore I'm attacking the actual institution.
Exactly,
without realizing the potential ramifications for the rest of the world.
Exactly. And remember that the White House and Number 10 are not saying Netanyahu has not committed or should not be suspected of the crimes. They are saying, number one, that the International Criminal Court should not draw equivalence between Netanyahu and Hamas leaders. And I have news for them. That's not drawing equivalence. That is equality before the law. What equality before the law requires is that due process should be followed in the case of every individual, whether they are president of Israel or prime minister of Israel or they are Hamas leaders. And then, James, no warrant has been issued. It is an application for the warrant to be issued. And if you know you have nothing to hide, all you need to do is to send your lawyers to represent you before the ICC to clear your name and to argue that the warrant should not be issued. But that's not what Netanyahu wants, or Biden or Sunak. What they want is for the warrant not to be issued, because it cannot be issued against a prime minister, even if he is alleged to have committed war crimes. That is trashing of the institution. It is an undermining of the international legal system. And there is a danger to that, because it is not just a moral imperative for us to respect the international legal system. These systems were instituted or improved after the Second World War in order to avoid another world war. And whenever you are trashing institutions, you risk instituting jungle justice. You risk instituting disorder in the world. And if that happens, all of us would pay.
And you're right. I mean, when Biden talks about equivalence, what he's really eschewing is equality before the law. If two people are accused of, for example, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, as a war crime, then equality before the law demands that both allegations, if made in good faith, are pursued to the full power of the investigating institutions or the judicial process. And Biden seems to be saying, no, not if it's our ally. But just before you go, because you've taken me way beyond the news, as I'm sure everybody listening would appreciate. But very briefly, with your training and background, do you think the warrants will be issued?
Absolutely, they would be issued, James. They would be issued if the judges would be fair, because even the U.S. itself, James. Remember, a few weeks ago, they halted further supply of weapons. And in their opinion, they said they think Israel might be using their weapons to commit war crimes or kill civilians. The U.S. itself had that opinion. And even the UK government, if you look at it over the past few weeks, they have started backpedaling, defending Israel in the way it is prosecuting the war. So everybody knows that there are questions to be answered. And we know that there has been another case in which they said an investigation into genocide is plausible. So there is already prima facie.
I think you said this correctly, but just for full clarification, it was the Palestinian people may need protecting from genocide was found to be plausible by the court.
Yes. And so what is required in these kinds of arrest warrants is whether there are reasonable grounds for arrest. Because you can only arrest on reasonable ground of suspicion of the commission of a crime.
Okay, and so in order for that to have been issued, and I know that some lawyers led by or Amal Clooney, heavily involved, have published the processes by which these requests were arrived at. Bulama, thank you. It's 25 to 11. I always worry when you ring me that you're neglecting your PhD studies.
No, I am not, James. James, I would tell you this. I think listening to your show and to LBC should be part of the PhD of everyone who didn't grow up in the UK. I am learning a lot, and it's part of my PhD, to be honest. Thank you.
Well, blimey. No, well, thank you. You elevate the programme every time you come on it. For people who don't know, Bulama Bukati is a dual-qualified lawyer in Nigeria and England and Wales, currently doing his PhD in law at SOAS. Thomas Watts, meanwhile, has your headlines. It is 10:39, a little late, but Bulama, I'm sure you'll agree, is always worth rolling the red carpet out for, such as his grasp of these matters. And really, it is the grasp of these matters that interest me most this morning. What would words of comfort sound like if you established the thesis that by allowing an ally to treat the International Criminal Court with contempt, to dismiss allegations of war crimes, up to and including the accusation of deliberately attempting to starve Palestinians. If you allow an ally to do that, what does it give to your enemies? How on earth could we talk about Vladimir Putin's offences in Ukraine with our full chests, if you like, if we are simultaneously allowing an ally to treat the court that has issued a warrant for Vladimir Putin's arrest with complete contempt, and I'm afraid that's not an exaggeration. And as Bulama pointed out, Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak are complicit in the trashing of the institution, of the International Criminal Court. I would welcome an explanation of why we don't need to worry about that. And if you think you've got one, then 0345 60 60973. I guess the American angle also invites the question of why can't Joe Biden speak up for the International Criminal Court? What is it that is at stake, given Chuck Schumer's comments about Israel becoming a pariah state and a broader condemnation of much of Benjamin Netanyahu's tactics from up to and including the White House? What is it about this call for arrest warrants that has Joe Biden balking quite so violently? If you want to join this conversation, 0345 60 60973 is the number that you need. The time now is 10:41 and Helen is in Dagenham. Helen, what would you like to say?
I wanted to comment on something that you said before the news. The people in Gaza are being deprived of food, water, etc., of medical supplies and so on, and it's a deliberate act by Israel that they are in this position. Yeah?
That's the charge. That
is the charge.
That the senior prosecutor has brought. Well, there are others. Willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body and health. Willful killing or murder as a war crime. Intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population as a war crime. Extermination and or murder, including in the context of deaths caused by starvation, as a crime against humanity. Persecution as a crime against humanity. And other inhumane acts as crimes against humanity.
If I could... I just wanted to make one point, and actually to ask you, because I don't know the answer to this question. When all this started on October the 7th, on the news in October, November, December, there were lots and lots of film of these great big food lorries, aid lorries, going through Egypt over the Rafah crossing into Gaza. And that was the only way that they could get big food lorries in. In actual fact, Egypt, I believe, ration, I think 20 a day or 25, something like that. And they trundled into Gaza with whatever they had on board, food, water, etc. Now, the Rafah crossing, which does cross from Egypt into Gaza, is controlled solely and only by the Egyptians.
Right.
If they open it, it's open. If they close it, it's closed. Israel has no say, no jurisdiction whatsoever. So if in this particular
I've just listed the charges that have been made against the Israeli politicians, and you're here to talk about the Egyptian administration.
I'm talking about what is called the deliberate starvation of the people in Gaza because they can't get supplies in.
Which is just one of the charges, of course, against the Israeli politicians.
Well, if I can do it one by one then, if you'll allow me.
Well, I don't know that we'll have time for you to do it one by one. I'm just intrigued by why accusations or allegations of war crimes against Israeli politicians have prompted you to start talking about the Egyptian administration.
Because you were talking about the systematic starvation of people, men, women and children, because they cannot get supplies in.
And you think that, I see, you think that's all Egypt's fault?
No, I'm saying to you that Egypt has closed the Rafah crossing.
Right.
Okay, they've closed it. For whatever reason they've closed it,
But you are, I mean, we're listing an incredible charge sheet of allegations against the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli Defense Minister, and you want us to talk about Egypt. I think a lot of people will find that quite confusing. And surely, if there is confusion, then all the more reason to send in a supranational organisation to allow international scrutiny to take place.
Now, you have seen the pictures, I take it, of the tunnels under Gaza going into Egypt.
Well, it depends where, on whose broadcasts.
It's on the news.
Whose media? Which media has published those pictures? Because I can't get my colleagues into Gaza. I can't. Matt Fry's not allowed in. Lise Doucette from the BBC isn't allowed in. Christiane Amanpour at CNN isn't allowed in. So we have to be very wary about what we think we know about what's going on in Gaza, which again, Helen, leads us back to the relevance and importance of allowing unbiased international
I'm not there,
observers in. So why? I mean, and also, I have seen pictures of settlers and activists preventing trucks getting through gates that are actually open. But again, I'm confused why you want the conversation to be about Egypt today.
Because I don't understand this mass starvation if there are tunnels connecting.
I think actually Israel currently has control. Israel does currently have control of the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing.
No, they do not. You're completely wrong. They have nothing to do with the Rafah crossing whatsoever. They never have had it. It's not under their jurisdiction. It's closed because the other side wants it to stay closed. Why?
No, well, I mean, you can keep saying that. It doesn't necessarily make it true. So the question I really want you to answer is why you want to talk about Egypt today.
The systematic starvation of
people. You can't. I'd rather you didn't just keep repeating yourself. Why do you want to talk about Egypt today and not about the ease, for example, with which Israel could refute these allegations?
Israel is being accused of starving the people in Gaza.
And willful killing and murder as a war crime and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population as a war crime and extermination and or murder, including in the context of deaths caused by starvation as a crime against humanity, persecution as a crime. I mean, if your point is valid, then you'd just raise it in court, wouldn't you, to prove that the accusation is not fair?
And when Israel wants to launch a big attack on Gaza...
you can't keep hopping away from everything I say. If your point is valid, and I'm far from sure that it is valid, but if it is, then Israel would be able to offer it up in defence of against the allegations. So why would they not do that then?
Why did they send thousands of leaflets into Gaza saying, get out? Where the people could go.
Sorry, go where? Go where? Helen?
Exactly, go where? But they gave them 6 hours notice to get out.
But to get out to go where? Because they've gone back to bombarding places that had been previously cleared. Some of these people have already moved 4 or 5 times. Again, on a morning where we're examining incredibly egregious allegations against the Israeli government, you seem to want the conversation to be about Egypt's government and pointless pamphlets dropped upon areas that were going to be bombed regardless of whether people moved or not.
You tend to assume that Gaza is an island and nothing can reach the island. It's not an island at all.
No one assumes that Gaza is an island. And I think I can say with some confidence that Israel is in control of the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing now.
No.
It's also not the only. It's also, of course, not the only way into Gaza. So why would Israel be preventing?
Never had. The Rafah crossing is an Egyptian-run.
But there's 2 sides to it, and there are lots of other ways into Gaza, which Israel, under your own analysis, would appear to be preventing passage through.
Are the underground tunnels built by
No, there's lots of gates going into Gaza from elsewhere. You can get in there from Israel without going through a tunnel. So why would that not be able to happen? Do you think?
But also you can get in there through the crossing and through the tunnels.
So again, I mean, today is the day that Israel stands accused of all manner of war crimes, and you want to talk about Egypt.
No.
I think you should just Google, before we continue, you should just Google Rafah and control and just clarify what the situation has been since, I think, May the 7th. Just in the interests of illumination. It's 10:48. 10:52 is the time. A couple of texts that I think are helpful in illustrating I guess, the difficulty of this entire conversation. The first is from George. It says, the sheer ignorance regarding the death of innocent lives by your last caller has sent shivers down my spine. Claiming that leaflets being sent to civilians 6 hours before areas were attacked is somehow sufficient notice is horrific. I'd like to say that if she was given a leaflet to leave her home and life 4 to 5 to 6 times in a few months, when would she say that enough is enough? But in the same sort of window of the programme, this from Sharon, how would you feel if someone entered your house and butchered your family? Would these indoctrinated callers do nothing? This is referring, I think, to callers before Helen, the last caller. Watch the Dr. Phil interview with Benjamin Netanyahu. It's difficult to seek out the Hamas terrorists when they hide amongst civilians and indeed shoot them themselves. Truly shocking. To which, in my own naive way, my response is, well, then surely this is the most powerful case imaginable for the importance of supranational institutions, for international judiciaries, international courts, international prosecutors, which means that I haven't even seen Hamas's response. I can't imagine Hamas are very pleased about these arrest warrants. But if you are, all of the things that supporters of Israel insist that Israel is, then you welcome the opportunity to prove that you're not guilty of any of these things. But I mean, there is a basic requirement to be clear about what is under discussion and what is undisputed in factual terms. We know exactly what the allegations are. Either we have faith in the International Criminal Court, or we allow the protection of Benjamin Netanyahu to remove that faith. That seems to be the challenge facing Western politicians, and Sunak and Biden have already jumped. John's in Bristol. John, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Yeah, this is also very depressing.
That's very true, I think. That's something on which we can all agree.
Yeah, I watched the proceedings live last week at The Hague, and it's really quite unbelievably shocking and disturbing and very upsetting. I mean, it's a hell of a rap sheet. It really is, especially with the discovery of 2 mass graves, which include hundreds of men, women, and children, and that have been executed and even decapitated, a few of them, and all manner of grotesque things. So it seems to me that if this is really, if it is proven that that this has really actually happened, then the fact that the British and American governments are aiding and abetting these war crimes is a terrible stain on humanity, but it's a terrible stain on
to which the only. I mean, unless there are sinister forces afoot in America and the UK, and in the governments of America and the UK, you would welcome the opportunity to examine the allegations. Why would you not welcome the opportunity to examine the allegations?
Exactly. If you're accused of such things, why on earth would you, if you were innocent, if you said, well, no, we haven't done any of these things, why would you not?
So let me tell you some of the responses to what you said. Mike's been in touch, say those graves were old, to which you respond by saying, well, okay, then that needs to be proved. That needs to be explored. That needs to be examined. And whether they were old or not, we need to know why it would appear that some corpses had their hands tied behind their back. I mean, it's come the point, perhaps inevitably, given the nature of this, of the rhetoric, never mind the actions on the ground, it feels as if you've reached to the point where we don't agree on anything anymore, up to and including the need for international independent scrutiny.
But
and you have to wonder why.
Yeah, we do. I mean, the hypocrisy is quite grotesque, isn't it? I mean, quite rightly, arrest warrants for Putin and stuff, but if you're going to call out his war crimes, you've got to call out the alleged war crimes.
Well, that was the interesting thing that Bilama said. Not even call them out. You just want to prosecute them, examine them, do the trial. But that was the interesting thing Bilama said about the International Criminal Court being widely criticised in the global south for its focus on African countries. It's sort of perceived perhaps as a bit of a fig leaf. We'll go after those countries, but we won't go after those countries. I presume America's refusal to recognise it hinges slightly on things, or entirely on things that America has done in the intervening period that they may not welcome closer scrutiny of. But the more we talk about it, Helen's points about Egypt notwithstanding, the more we talk about it, the harder it becomes to see any sense or any decency even in the argument that you don't want the allegations to be examined. I mean, if you accuse me of something and I know that I'm innocent, then I relish the opportunity for those accusations to be examined. No?
Otherwise, it just screams guilty, doesn't it? If it's just what have you got to hide if you think you're innocent?
Well, I'm welcoming anyone to challenge that conclusion, because at the moment, I'm not quite sure how you would do so, except with whataboutery and red herrings. But if you don't want the allegations to be examined in court and to avail yourself of the opportunity to refute them, then what other possible explanation can there be other than a fear of what would be found? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Ali's in Barnet. Ali, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I just wanted to quickly, touch on that point as to why it is that America's distancing themselves. I mean, firstly, I wanted to just sort of set the scene. I mean, we're talking about Netanyahu, a guy who was officially indicted for breach of trust and accepting bribes. So that's the sort of context.
And I think the phone line's just gone down. It's probably an intervention from the on high. No, we've lost Ali. So, I mean, he makes the point, I think, about Netanyahu's legal difficulties domestically, which he has sought to evade and avoid. So the idea that he would somehow internationally prostrate himself before the courts and before judges would be fanciful, to say the very least. And we are short of time anyway. I crashed the last news. So Ali, in 30 seconds, mate. That's all I've got. I do apologise, but that's the way it goes.
No, that's absolutely fine. So I was just saying, look, it's a pattern. Every single time, majority of countries vote for Israel being punished for their crimes or whatever they're doing.
America votes against.
America votes against, and guess what? If your friend was labelled a murderer, what are you going to say? Yeah, I'm friends with him. No, you're going to say no. I don't know that guy. Especially if
you've given him the weapons with which he has committed the murder. Exactly. I mean, I wonder if America actually under that regime
complicit in all the crimes that they get accused of.
Well, they're not even. Yeah. Well, you'd be complicit in all the crimes they are accused of, which, of course, leaves the question of why would Joe Biden not want Israel to avail itself of the opportunity to refute these allegations? And I suspect Ali has just provided what would be the most comprehensive answer of all. So just to remind you, 5 men, Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Daif and Ismail Haniyeh, are all the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court is seeking arrest warrants on war crime charges for all 5 of them. And it would appear that Rishi Sunak and Joe Biden think that there should be one rule under international law for the 3 Hamas leaders and another rule for the Israel leaders. And I guess at the end of this hour, you either agree with that double standard or you don't. 3 minutes after 11 is the time. My thanks to Damien for digging out the relevant quote. We'll just say this in conclusion of the conversation in the last hour, although I suspect, however desperately you wish I wouldn't, if you are a fully paid up member of the Benjamin Netanyahu fan club, we will be returning to this territory in the not too distant future. But just to read this, this quote is from the independent panel of lawyers who advised the ICC prosecutor. There is no conflict that should be excluded from the reach of the law, no child's life valued less than another's. The law we apply is humanity's law, not the law of any given side. It must protect all the victims of this conflict and all civilians in conflicts to come. The majority of the lawyers who advise the ICC prosecutor are, in fact, eminent British lawyers, and yet it is the British government that chooses to dismiss their findings. And thank you to Damien for these words as well. I always find your approach to this subject balanced and constructive, James. Well, it is, unless, of course, you hate balance, in which case you don't agree with this statement that I'll read again. You don't agree with this statement. There is no conflict that should be excluded from the reach of the law. No child's life valued less than another's. So, Hamas might treat these institutions, these ideas, these laws with complete contempt, but that is what terrorist organizations or death cults or whatever description you prefer are expected to do. Democratically elected governments with Western allies are expected to do different. So if, as some of my texters have been reduced to this morning, if you're really seeking to defend Israel's response by saying that Hamas would be equally contemptuous and dismissive of international law, then I'm afraid you're actually making exactly the opposite point from the one that you think you're making. You're doing that thing that Joe Biden told you not to do, which is to see some sort of equivalence between Israel and Hamas. But that is, I guess, the point to which Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right allies have pushed you. 6 minutes after 11 at the time. I resisted the urge there to add, speaking of the far right, let's have a look at what Mel Strider's got to say about migrant staff. I mean, what a grim phrase that is. I'll give you a quick heads up in a minute on something you just heard in the news bulletin about Rishi Sunak and his so-called Rwanda deportation plan. He must by now know the truth. So he's being incredibly disingenuous, if not dishonest, when he speaks in the way that you just heard him speaking in the news bulletin. When Ian Duncan Smith was touring studios, Ian Duncan Smith has done two things in the last few months that in a normal country would have garnered rather more attention than they have. The first that he did was incite criminal damage of ULEZ cameras to speak out in defence of people vandalising them. That, of course, from a former leader of the Party of Law and Order. But the second was to tour studios blithely explaining that people would be deported to Rwanda to have their applications processed, and in the event of those applications being successful, then they would come back to the United Kingdom to make their lives here. That's categorically untrue. Rishi Sunak appears to be either pretending that it isn't untrue or allowing the Austrian president on this trip to Vienna to do what is known in the trade as an Ian Duncan Smith. So I may give you a heads up on that a little later. But before all of that, we're here again. It's such a weird one, isn't it? If you looked at that list we made the other day of all the things that if you were in charge, you would be prioritising, I guess we can add to that list today compensation for victims of the infected blood scandal, but all the things that the government could be directing its attention to, and all I ever hear from them now, I think, is a combination of we don't want any foreigners and people on benefits are scum. That is literally, it's as if it's been boiled down. You know when the kettle is empty and you've just got sort of flinty residue stuck in the bottom of the kettle, or if you leave a coffee cup out overnight and you're just left with a sort of a tarry coating at the bottom of the mug. That's what the Tories are now reduced to. Can you remember the last time they said anything about domestic politics that was not in some way a variation upon either an attack upon people seeking to come here to work or an attack on people who already live here and can't currently work? Is there anything? Can you think of anything that gets filed under domestic Conservative Party policy that is not either an attack upon foreign workers or an attack upon domestic non-workers or an attack on both? God, man, that's worth pausing for a minute to reflect on, isn't it? Isn't it? Because that is it now, isn't it? It's literally all they've got. They can't even muster up enough planes for a D-Day celebration, but they're still banging on about stop relying. Mel Stride's doing it again today. That definition of insanity that Albert Einstein never actually said about doing the same thing over and over again in the hope of a different result. It's rarely been more pertinent, has it, than in this twin crackdown on immigration and sick. They don't even deny it, by the way. That's the phrase the Daily Telegraph uses. It's a twin crackdown on immigration and sickness benefits. So the latest idea is that we will be able to get rid of all the foreign workers or reduce net migration by hundreds of thousands a year by getting all the people on long-term sickness benefits into jobs. It will make more domestic staff available. And I honestly don't know where to begin. If you are possessed of any levels of empathy beyond the average Murdoch tabloid columnist, then this is obviously so not a simplistic issue that you would struggle to treat Mel Stride with anything other than contempt. The idea that there are hundreds of thousands of people on long-term sickness benefits who could be working and the sectors in which they could be working include construction and hospitality and various other, of course, care homes, manufacturers. That's what he's going to tell you, that if you run a pub, if you run a restaurant, if you run a care home, if you run a construction firm, or if you run a manufacturing company, you must employ more Britons. I can't even today bring myself to wonder what it must be like to be a foreign-born worker. I don't even like the phrase migrant staff. It sounds dehumanising to me. But here you are. You have come here from France or Nigeria, Germany, or Romania, and you're working bloody hard, and you turn your radio on and hear someone banging on about the twin crackdown on foreign... They're talking about you. What have I done wrong? You would reasonably wonder. I work hard. I pay my taxes. Why am I under attack? Why doesn't Mel Stride want me here? What have I done to deserve this level of contempt from an incompetent Tory politician? Short answer is I don't know. And of course, if you're on long-term sickness benefit or you've got mental health conditions, and what on earth goes through your mind when you hear Mel Stride saying that you should be working in the construction industry or in a care home or working in a pub or a restaurant or a factory? Are there any factories left? I mean, I guess the question that I should ask you is one that would just prompt a repetitious roll call of responses. I don't know that there would be a varied and nuanced conversation to be had. If I said, do you think Mel Stride really means this? Or do you just think it is the laziest sort of political posturing? Do you honestly think that Mel Stride believes or has the evidence to prove that we can comfortably tell 300,000 people poised to come here to take up jobs that exist that we don't want them to come, and that instead those jobs will be done by people currently on long-term sickness benefits or with milder mental health conditions? I don't want you to laugh at this, but I'm not even sure who to feel sorriest for this morning. The people we've spoken to on a grimly regular basis who would love nothing more than to be able to go to work but can't, or the people that are going to work every day but are hearing from their media and the government of the country in which they pay tax, are hearing that we don't actually want you here after all. Whose experience is currently harder? The person working who's been told to clear off, or the person not working who's been told that they should be, despite the fact that their own doctor has said that they can't? The disconnect from observable reality is so complete that I guess if you held a gun to my head, I would probably have to conclude that Mel Stride knows that he's talking gibberish. Mel Stride knows that this is absolute codswallop. $3,000 to firms who employ an apprentice and funding of up to $5,000 to pay for specialist training for new staff. So there's another mythical cohort of people who would be perfectly capable of doing skilled labour if only the companies were capable of training them or paying them to do it. I can't see any elements of this problem that plausibly exist. And yet, quote the Daily Telegraph, the twin crackdown on immigration and sickness benefits seems to me to be pretty much the only thing that this government is going to campaign on in the next election. A twin crackdown on people with jobs who weren't born here and people without jobs who were. It's incredible, isn't it? So, how best to handle this? Is it employers, do you think, we should talk to first? I think it probably is. I know you're busy. I know you've got a lot on. But I've done the conversation from the other end of the telescope on a few occasions. I know what it's like to be signed off long-term sick. I know how hard it is, A, to survive on the pittance that you're paid, and B, to get the provision and the protection that you need. But Mel Stride thinks you're all swinging the lead. So let's look instead at pubs and restaurants, care homes, construction firms and manufacturers. I guess most obviously, history has taught me that if you're listening to this programme and you're minded to ring in from any of those sectors, it would probably be hospitality and care homes that come to the front of the queue. So let me take that to urge you, if you work in construction or manufacturing, to redress the balance slightly. How do you respond to the news, because I presume it's news to you, that there are loads of Britons out there, British-born people out there, that you could and should be employing, but for reasons known only to you, currently are not? So as an employer, how do you respond to Mel Stride's insistence that somehow you are deliberately not employing British workers and instead favouring foreign-born staff? So if you're in construction, if you're in manufacturing, if you're running a care home or running a restaurant or running a pub, just talk me through the reality of filling vacancies and your response to the idea that you could easily be filling these vacancies with British people if only ... And therefore, your hard-working, cherished colleagues who happen to have been born somewhere else can be handed their sandwiches, wrapped in a roadmap, and given what I suppose will one day become known as the Brexit elbow and sent back to wherever it is they came from. That's what I want to look at. Not the politics, not the rhetoric, not the rancid, quasi-racist intent behind these ludicrous pronouncements, but at the reality of filling vacancies in your business. Any business at all. But most obviously, because this is what Mad Mel is going to be talking about today, pubs, restaurants, care homes, construction firms and manufacturers. You work in those sectors or you run a business in those sectors. And the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions is saying to you today that you are somehow responsible for not hiring British workers, and that if only he just tweaks a few things, then you will be able to do so. Just respond to that for me first on 0345 6060 973. And I may, later in this, I don't know, it depends on how enthusiastically you take up that invitation. But I do find myself drawn increasingly to the question of what's it like to be a hard-working citizen of this country who didn't happen to be born here, who cannot turn on their television or their radio or open a newspaper or go online anymore without reading that you are very unwelcome, and that the top priority of the government to whom you pay your taxes is to stop people like you from coming here to work hard. I can't quite get my head around that. But I may invite you to help me a little later this hour. But I want to begin with employers. Employers who are somehow deliberately not hiring British workers. Just respond to Mel Stride's claims for me on 0345 6060 973. Some days you even start thinking whether it's you that's gone mad. Maybe it's true. Maybe after 14 years in power, the Conservatives have stumbled across millions of people perfectly capable of work who've chosen not to for unspecified reasons and have been signed off sick instead with serious illnesses or mental health conditions. And by getting them into the construction sector, we'll be able to build another wall in Dover and stop people coming in to work in our restaurants and our pubs, our care homes and our factories. Maybe it's true. Do you see what I mean? You sort of sit here and think this is so obviously rank and wrong that either they've all gone mad or I have. So we'll ask employers what they think. Mel Stride will say later today, I know this presents a recruitment challenge for some employers in certain sectors, particularly those that have relied on migration in the past. So if you currently have a lot of foreign workers on your payroll, how do you greet the news that Mel Stride is going to stop them coming here and that you'll be able to fill those gaps really easily from the British-born population? 21 minutes after 11. Pindy is in West Lothian in Scotland. Pindy, what made you pick up the phone?
James, I must just say first, I've loved you since I've been in this country. You've actually kept some sanity to me. You've actually made this country make sense to me most of the time. Actually driving to work. I mean, I used to work on minimum wage. I've been here for 20 years.
Okay.
I worked on minimum wage. I paid my taxes, do what you're supposed to do. I've got a 15-year-old boy now.
Yes.
They put you on this 10-year process. Let me tell you, every 2.5 years, you have to renew your visa. And, James, I can tell you one thing. The cheapest price you're going to pay between a solicitor and all the expenses they ask you is at least about £6,000 to £7,000. Now, I don't know where you're supposed to get that, but that's how much it costs. I'm not even lying to you.
No,
a few years ago, NHS fee that you had to pay as an immigrant was about £1,000 and some change. Now it's gone up to £3,000 just for the NHS. Bearing in mind you can hardly get an appointment if you've got a chest infection.
Yes.
But,
so this is a really good
And
point. This is a really important point because what they've sought to do after the UKIPification of the Tory party, what they have sought to do, they've fetishised these figures. And they said, we will bring these figures down. And by hook or by crook, because they're going after university students as well at the moment. They don't care who is on that list. They want to bring the numbers down. So the first thing they did was make it much, much less attractive for people like you to work here. By hitting you with these visa charges and these NHS surcharges and all of these extra expenses that you are forced to protect, while simultaneously portraying you as some sort of scrounger or the thief of British jobs. And this is just the latest in these. It's
the most uncomfortable thing you have to go through every year because you don't know. And let me tell you, so after you've done the 2.5 application and you pay that $6,000, you can wait for a year and a half to get an answer from them. Now you're living on the edge. You don't know what's coming. Is it HMRC? Is it the government? You don't know what's coming, and you're doing exactly what you're supposed to do. It's just the most unkind country, if you ask me personally.
Well,
and I don't think you guys
not
have
the people, I
learned from
hope.
Brexit.
Not the people, I hope, but certainly some of the politicians, certainly this particular government. What about the idea? What you haven't told me what sector you work in, but what about the idea that don't?
I work in care.
Okay, well, what about Mel Stride's idea that we don't need you? Thank you very much. Because there's a British woman. Why are you laughing? There's a British woman over there who just needs.
I'm laughing because I can tell you one thing: the UK can't afford that. They really can't afford to kick out foreigners. They really can't.
No one's talking about kicking you out. So it's a mythical, it's a putative Pindi that I'm talking about. It's Pindi 2.0.
At this stage, I don't know.
Well, yes, you've got a job there. So, but the idea that the next time your employer needs to fill a vacancy in the care sector where you work, they won't have Pindi 2.0. They'll be able to get me or a British-born person who's currently doing an unspecified thing all day. They will be able to fill the vacancy that you would previously have filled. Where does that come from?
Well, good luck to that. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
Good luck to that, James, to be frank with you.
I like good luck. Thank you, Pindi. I like good luck, and I'll take your good wishes and your kind words, but I want to know, what do you do in response to that question other than just offer up good luck? John's cross about immigration. He says you've got 1.2 million added in the past 2 years and you're arguing for more immigration. I'm not arguing for anything, John. I'm just asking who is going to do the jobs that people like Pindi do. And Mel Stride, and presumably you, will answer by saying all the British people on sickness benefit. And I think that's really stupid. But I'm happy to be proved wrong with evidence and experience, not with racist rhetoric. 25 minutes after 11 is the time. Ron's in Croydon. Ron, what would you like to say?
How you doing? Yeah, I worked in construction for many years, and it was like some of the foreign lads that were on site. They would do anything that was asked of them without a moan or a groan. But some of the English lads, they'd be more like, I'm not doing that.
I must be a bit. No, I'm not going to give you lessons on what your experience was, but there'll be good workers from all backgrounds and bad workers from all backgrounds. But if I've schlepped my way over here from Eastern Europe, most obviously, and I'm trying to make as much money as I can in the time,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. But I know that's just my experience. That's why I sway for maybe employers are going to be more inclined to.
It's a terrible phone line. It sounds like you're in a cement mixer, Ron. Are you working at the moment?
No, I'm not in a cement mixer at the moment. No.
All right. Well, I can't sustain that phone line. It's dismal. But you've made your point. I don't like stereotyping, but I think there is probably some truth in the fact that if you've slept halfway around the world to work here, then you are going to have a slightly different relationship with work than if you've just dragged your carcass out of bed that morning when you'd rather have stayed in it. I don't know. That's possibly me doing positive stereotyping in the face of so much negative stereotyping. But what if this is complete bunkum? What if the entire government is now dedicated to, in the words of their friends and fans on the Daily Telegraph, a twin crackdown on immigration and sickness benefits? But what if the problem doesn't exist in the way that they portray it? What if there is no secret army, silent army of British workers waiting to insert themselves into the vacancies that would have otherwise been filled by new arrivals? It is yet more evidence of a country embarked upon a really scary trajectory. Ruben's in Liverpool. Ruben, what would you like to say?
Thanks, James. I don't work in the sector anymore, but I worked in hospitality for about 10 years, and I used to manage a hotel down on the southeast coast in East Sussex, and I'm still on very good terms with the owner there, and I know they're struggling a lot for staff coming up to the summer period now.
Yes.
And I think the quality of candidates just isn't there, especially from British candidates, as we've already mentioned. But particularly, I think if the implication from Mel Stride is that if you have two candidates, one's from Europe and they're good quality candidate with a lot of experience in the sector, and the other isn't, but they're British, you should hire the British one.
Yeah.
It just seems like we're going to have a decline in services and in everything. Even if it's an unskilled position, you still need to have a good rapport with customers. You still need to be able to write an email or a menu without spelling mistakes. And quite frankly, in my experience, even going back years and years ago, a lot of the best candidates were from Europe. Well, they were Spanish, they were Italian. They might have been over here only for a season, but they were the best candidates for the job. And ultimately, isn't that what we want in the sector?
No. We don't care about how good they are at the job. We care only about where they were born, Ruben. I think that's become pretty clear in the last couple of years, and if not, certainly in the last couple of months. Obviously, I'm being facetious, but what about the possibility? I almost don't want to entertain this, but I think it's important that we do. What about the possibility that there are young British people who could potentially be wonderful adornments to the hospitality industry, but for reasons are currently not being so or not working at all, and that somehow Mel Stride is the man to tempt them into the workplace, or that a $3,000 payment to, I don't know whether you can be an apprentice chef, I imagine. So the government is going to give $3,000 to your old employer to persuade them to train a British-born person who has currently not managed to get a berth in the hospitality industry, and they will be. Do you see what I mean? I mean, there's 9 million people in total, but do we know for sure? I mean, where are they? I would say to Mel Stride, where are these people? Could you show them to me? The ones that could do the jobs that are currently being done by recent arrivals, by foreign.
And I think that's part of the problem. Where are they? Because a lot of them, you know, if you go into a city in the UK, you'll find that a lot of the hospitality industry workers are British. They might be uni students who work part-time or whatever. But if you go into areas like Cornwall or areas like East Sussex, where the price of housing and the cost of living prices anyone under the age of 40 out of staying in the area, most people leave at the age of 18. So what you get when you're an employer in those areas, particularly when it's not the season where you get European workers over, what you get is you get people who are over the age of 60 who have, for whatever reason, left a steady job and are trying to get something just for those last few years. Or you get 16-year-olds who, with the best will in the world, as hardworking as they might be, don't necessarily have the confidence or the experience that you need in some of those roles. You can give, and you haven't got
but you haven't got the time and the space to let them develop the confidence and the experience, because your customers' experience in the meantime would be diminished enormously. That's the thing.
Absolutely, and that's not going to change if you just throw some money at it. You know, they can provide grants and things like that, but that's not going to give people who don't have experience in the roles, especially if, like I mentioned, they might work for a couple of years until they're 18 for you, and then they'll move. Then they'll go to uni, and then they'll maybe stay wherever they move to for uni.
Do you think they believe it? Do you think Mel Stride's going to deliver a speech today in which he will, I believe...
It's hard to tell, isn't it?
Describe a reality that doesn't exist, but do you think he thinks it does exist?
On some level, I think they probably do. Rishi and that, they seem completely detached.
So where are they, Rishi? Where are these people? Where are they? Are they under the bed, or do you think they're all lying about being sick, in which case all the doctors are complicit in an epidemic of bogus sickness benefits? Someone with mental health problems going into the construction industry or care homes or restaurants seems to me, in my naive worldview, a little bit suboptimal, but they believe that there are, and their friends in the media believe with no evidence. There's a whole army of unemployed British people just waiting to jump into jobs currently being done by foreign-born people, and they can't explain to us why it's not currently happening. It's madness. Ruben, thank you. It's 11:31. Thomas Watts has your headlines. 25 minutes to 12. The sectors are changing. For good or for ill. You probably noticed it, and I don't know what the statistics are, but it's not anecdotal to describe fewer post-Brexit arrivals from the EU. So particularly in the service sector, people working in restaurants and pubs, I find myself encountering fewer staff from Eastern European countries or European countries, and more staff from, you can't judge 100% by appearance, but by accent and appearance, more and more staff who seem to be coming from Southeast Asia. And I guess the Tory party unlikely to be in power when these particular chickens come home to roost. But if you have promised less immigration, then the kind of people you're appealing to, I would cautiously suggest, have probably got an even bigger problem with brown foreigners than they have with white foreigners. I always remember the callers to this programme claiming that they'd voted for Brexit because there were too many brown faces on the tills in Tesco or Sainsbury's. It was an infamous call to the programme, but not not an extraordinary one. There were plenty of people of that view. And, of course, Brexit has seen immigration skyrocket. And now the people who brought you Brexit are attacking the people who've come here to work, in many cases, to fill the vacancies in our workforce caused by the Brexit that they promised would reduce immigration. So the vacancies were created. British people did not move into them. Foreign-born people did, albeit from different countries, different territories from the ones that were traditionally doing those jobs in construction and hospitality, care homes and manufacturing. We told them to clear off, and they have done. The vacancies were not miraculously filled by Mel Stride's army of British shirkers. I mean, it's offensive to British people to claim that we're all lazy or that 9 million of us are swinging the lead. And it's offensive to foreign workers because you're telling them that we don't really want them here at all. And yet this appears to be the only platform upon which the Tories are preparing to fight the next general election. Cammie's in Chelmsford. Cammie, what would you like to say?
Hello, good morning. Sorry.
Hello, Cammie.
Good morning. Yeah, I woke last night. I'm sorry. My name is Kemi. I'm from Nigeria.
Yeah.
And I work long hours, sometimes 40 hours, sometimes 50 hours. I've got 2 kids with autism. I came into this country, and I've never for one day thought I was going to claim benefits. I work hard, and I see people rich. I'm so sorry.
It's not. I don't know. The phone line's terrible. Just hold the phone a little bit further away from your mouth, if you would, Cammie, because I can't quite, or unless I'm on speaker or something. But I'm not hearing you completely.
I'm not on speaker.
That's better. So 40 to 50 hours a week. Can I ask what sector you work in?
I work 20-something hours in NHS. Then I work with agency as well, 20-something hours. So I make up 50 hours a week.
As a nurse?
No, as a HCA.
Okay, so as a healthcare assistant. So you're doing 40 to 50 hours a week in the NHS and in the private sector.
Yes.
Having come here from Nigeria. What do you hear then on days like today when the Work and Pension Secretary is saying that we don't really want people like you working in these jobs? We'd much rather have someone not working in these, who was born somewhere else, who was born in Britain.
The problem is the British companies themselves that come to Nigeria do adverts in the papers all the time, non-stop, asking for workers.
Really?
Yes, advert in the papers that even the country, Nigeria, you go to the general hospital in Nigeria, they tell you there are no more doctors. You have to wait for some hours because all the doctors have gone to the UK. So it's not the fault of the people coming here. I see people who are directors in the pharmaceutical companies in Nigeria who came here to work as HCAs.
Really?
Because they want to give their kids a better life. You ask them, why did they come? You're a director.
Well, we've tried that. We've tried that. So what we'll do next time is we'll say, I think they've already tried. You can come here if you want, but you can't bring your children. You can't bring your children.
Yeah.
In fact, you can't have children.
Yeah. So it's not the fault of the people coming here.
No, I know that.
Everybody wants a better life for themselves. So when you see adverts saying, we need you to come and work for us, of course, you're going to take up the offer. When somebody's advertising saying, we need you to come and work.
I don't what's the alternative? That we stop inviting people like you to come here and work and then cross our fingers that someone's going to turn up for that job, someone's going to apply for that job who's capable of doing it and is currently not doing anything.
They're always saying that, the British people don't want to work. They don't want to do the care jobs. So they go abroad where they see that people are desperate to work and they bring them.
Oh, well, I'm even more confused, and I'm very sorry that you have to experience this conversation, both in the media and in the political space, when really all you need to do is get your head down and try and get some kit. I mean, it's extraordinary. Lots of people texting me to support you, people from Nigeria saying that is absolutely the case. The adverts are everywhere. Mel Stride must know that. I suspect the people running these companies are Tory donors or Tory adjacent. Why doesn't he go after them? It's like the fella at the weekend who's become a member of the Sunday Times Rich List because he owns a lot of hotels where asylum seekers are being put up. I don't know for sure, but I doubt he's a Labour supporter. I could be wrong. 11:40 is the time. Cammie, you take care. Try and get some snooze. Chris is in St Ives. Chris, what's going on?
Hi. Thanks for having me on, James. First-time caller.
You're very welcome.
James, I'm a South African citizen. I've been here now for 20 years. I haven't gone through the naturalization process, so I'm still South African, and I work in the pharmacy sector.
Right.
And I have about 75 people who work for my company.
Cool.
Finding it incredibly difficult post-Brexit and post the pandemic in finding staff. And I agree with everything you've said. We have had lots of pharmacists who from the EU have now left.
Yes, of course.
Felt very unwelcome.
Well, they were. They didn't just feel unwelcome. They were unwelcome. We told them that.
Very, very, very unwelcome. And that's created a huge gap in the market, not just for pharmacists, in the healthcare sector in general, nurses, doctors. And we even struggle to find healthcare assistants now.
Yeah, support staff as well.
Advertising, minimum wage has gone up, and the government's taken the credit for employers like myself paying the higher wages. And it's become terribly unaffordable.
So that puts your businesses under existential threat. But the bit that Pindi reminded me of is how, well, I don't know what actually I'm interested in whether or not you would use this word, because some of the things that Pindi described, particularly on the lower income jobs, even in the care sector, even in the healthcare sector, it's almost as if the government has tried to make it prohibitively expensive for people to come here and do those jobs. So the amount that they have to pay in visas, the requirements of minimum income before you can come and bring spouses and all. So they've actually tried almost to cut off the supply by making it prohibitively expensive and incredibly difficult to come here. Certainly if you wanted, as Kemi just reminded us, certainly if you wanted to bring your family, they've made that almost impossible. And yet the vacancies haven't been mysteriously miraculously filled by British-born people. They haven't.
Furlough, I think first furlough as well. People have become used to not working full-time, and can't blame them. I work 60 hours a week, and people want to have a quality of life. I don't envy that.
If they're subsidising it themselves, they're funding it themselves, and it's none of Mel Stride's business, is it?
Exactly.
So what's going to happen? I mean, what is the current? Like, you've got, let's say, you put up 5 vacancies tomorrow. Who's going to apply for them, and how hard will they be to fill?
Well, most of the vacancies are applied for by foreign workers, and I can't employ them because they don't have work permits.
Right.
So I now have applied for. So I have a sponsor. I can sponsor foreign workers.
Right.
But it's so difficult. They have to fit certain criteria. And if it's for the low-end jobs, then I can't afford to pay them the higher wages that they need to get the visa. So it's a catch-22, unfortunately.
Well, is it, though? Because, I mean, a catch-22 means that it doesn't brook any solution. Mel Stride's solution is that if you just look hard enough, I don't know if you've checked under the bed or behind the sofa, if you just look hard enough, you've got a perfect British-born candidate just waiting for you to come along and give them the opportunity to join your pharmaceutical company. I mean, I'm not going mad. I know you're laughing. But that's what he's saying to you, I think. Can you hear any other message? You just need to look a bit harder, Chris, and you'll find someone British to do the job that you currently can't find anyone to do. It's madness.
Yes, it is madness. It is madness. I think back to square one, really investment in education, and that's what we need here. Yes, I'm all for employing British workers. I'm all for that, but we need the people to employ and the right skills and the right skill sets. So,
and that's what we haven't done. And if I'd been in charge for 14 years, and people were asking why the generation that started school when I came to power had not emerged from school with the requisite skills and attributes needed to become treasured members of the workforce, I would probably be trying to blame it all on foreigners as well. Chris, thank you. A quite sanguine contribution, but nonetheless stunning, really, just to think that that's Mel Stride's theory. Does anybody want to have a go at giving Mel Stride a break? At actually saying, no, James, that's not what Mel Stride's saying at all. He knows that these people exist, the people who could fill Chris's vacancies, the people that could fill the staff roster at a hotel on the South Coast, the people that could fill that factory. He knows they're British and he knows where they are. And all he's doing is letting the dog see the rabbit. He's joining the dots. You've got all of these people perfectly capable of doing these jobs who are British, and then you've got all of these vacancies that are currently either being filled by people who aren't British or not being filled at all, and Mel Stride's magic wand will be waved, and in an instant it will all be it will all be solved. It's 11:46. It is 11:49, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I do worry sometimes that the political discourse has become so completely corrupted that it's going to be generational before we can return to a semblance of normal. I mention that today because of Mel Stride's apparent belief that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of British people currently not doing jobs in the care sector, the manufacturing sector, the healthcare sector, the construction sector, and the hospitality sector. Millions of them, currently not doing jobs in those sectors or indeed anywhere else, who just need to be tweaked or tempted slightly in order to do it. And all of the foreign-born people who are doing these jobs, either currently or in our futures, will be rendered surplus to requirements. It's just the more we talk about it, oddly, the madder the whole conversation becomes, and the scarier it is to reflect upon the fact that it appears to be the only thing that this government have got. I haven't even explained to you yet why Rishi Sunak is being deeply disingenuous about the so-called Rwanda deportation plan on this photo opportunity trip to Vienna. 11:51 is the time. In the next hour, because remember, I'm with you until 1 o'clock every day, you lucky, lucky people. In the next hour, looking at a story about the proportion of young adults who know about D-Day, and probably some old adults as well, as the 80th anniversary will unfold on June the 6th, and a frankly remarkable, or maybe not remarkable, but a troubling proportion of young people don't even know what it is. They don't even know what will be commemorated on the 80th anniversary. So in the next hour, just to give you a quick heads up, I'm going to look at two elements of that story. The first is, why is it important that they do? And the second will be, how do you make young people more interested in... the first bit might, of course, come up with the conclusion that we shouldn't be trying to make people more interested in that period of British history. But if we conclude that we should be, then how would it work? How would that happen? 11:52 is the time. Quick word from Peter, who is currently up a tower crane close to King's Cross, and adds, I'm Polish, James. I've been in the UK for 11 years. Sometimes it feels like I live at the beginning of the movie Children of Men, where they are hunting for foreigners. It's in Orwell as well, actually. The cinema scene in 1984 is one of the most chilling, where Orwell describes footage of refugees being shot out of the water, which, of course, people in British public discourse have come to call for in recent years, while people in the cinema auditorium cheer hysterically at the sight, particularly grisly sights of refugees being butchered on their cinema screens. Jar is in Raynham. Jar, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, I had something to say, but I thought I'm going to take a gamble and try and take your challenge.
Go on, then.
Well, basically, I don't believe there's tens of thousands of people that can work and want and
millions,
so on.
Millions.
I don't believe it. But there is a problem, which I've mentioned to you before.
Go on.
And one of them is employers will not employ people without experience. Does it matter if you've passed the exams and you've done whatever is required to get
but then,
you in there?
If that's true, no one would ever get employed.
Well, the situation is, I'll give you two examples. Yeah. I worked within social services to begin with.
Okay.
And I wanted to work with mental health. And I never got in. 30 years, couldn't get in.
Yeah.
I'm in my 60s now. Because they wanted 2 years experience. Didn't matter what I had. The second now, I'm an HGV driver. The Class 1, which is the biggest one you can drive in England.
Yeah.
And 7 years, and they wouldn't let me drive it, even though I had passed the test and I'd had X amount of years of driving. And I only got behind the wheel, not because of what I knew, but who I knew. I worked for an employer that said to me, as an agency worker, if you come over, I'll let you drive one.
Yeah.
And at the moment, there's two lads there now who've got their Class 1, and they've got no hope because he's not taking any more chances. So they're working for him, doing what's classed as a Class 2, but they can't get the experience to go one up.
So if he is prevented from employing experienced staff from overseas, then he will have no choice but to provide opportunities for the inexperienced staff.
And that's why I believe that's why I'm not believing why the people on the outskirts of London, which is mostly industrial and not they kicked up a stink against people from abroad that had the experience, because they blamed them for not being able to get to work. And that's why even if you did another referendum again, all the people on the outskirts would still continue to vote because some of them are getting work.
Maybe. So the polling doesn't necessarily... Yes, but that's the fascinating thing, isn't it? So I'm more interested in you because of... I mean, you wanted to get into mental health care and couldn't because of the requirements. Yeah. I mean,
not to do with expats or...
No, well, I was going to say the statistics don't support the idea that those jobs were actually being filled by foreigners, but in the HGV world, they probably do. I mean, HGV was the first sector, wasn't it, that got these sort of special dispensations because of the post-pandemic shortage of lorry drivers, and that's when you slotted in. But the thing is, Joe, there's a big problem with your testimony. Do you know what it is?
Go
on, have a think.
I might be right.
No. Yeah, no, I mean, you might be, but there's a huge, huge flaw here that I've only just spotted in the nick of time.
You know, my IQ...
Don't change the subject. Just pay attention. What's the problem with you as a case study in Mel Stride's mythical army?
That I'm a slight evidence of what he might be saying, and he'll exaggerate it.
No, you already had a job. You already had a job.
Ah, right.
So who's doing the job you used to have?
Yeah, I hear you, but I'm just saying
you don't hear me.
Listen, I've seen.
It was a good go. You had a good swing at it, man. It was a sterling effort, Jar. But you are not Mel Stride.
I'll call you again because I'm very careful what to pick up, because I know what's going to happen to me, and I get scared and I don't do it.
Oh, no! Right. Don't say that. You make me sound mean. No, you make an excellent point about access to these jobs. But for me, listening to you, and the clouds are clearing now at a rate of knots, you sound driven. You sound driven and ambitious. So you were looking for other opportunities. When you worked in a children's home, you wanted to extend into mental health care. Then you saw opportunities in HGV, and you pursued your connections with a potential employer to secure yourself a job. You are not the people that Mel Stride is talking about, Jar.
Now, before you end it, I've got two little points. Please don't tell me goodbye. Right, one, I worked as a manager within a residential home.
Yes, a children's home.
Yeah. And basically what happened was that the owner of the premises, because of cost, brought in staff and had no experience. I could not work with them on the normal working rules that was applied for workers, which meant was that they had their holiday pays, but also gave them days off where if they need to take the time off, don't ring in sick. Just say to me, I can't come into work today or tomorrow. And I filled the rota with that. And it was practices like that I had to change that other homes didn't have. And I had the best home by the end of the year.
I'm sure.
Because I was working with them, and then in turn they were working with me.
Treating them like human beings rather than widgets.
Correct.
To slot. So what was point two? What's point two? We're going to run out of time. What's point two?
Oh, sorry. I worked in the Cayman Islands, and it was every day when they talk radio, the expats are the problems. And I used to get that day in, day out, get out, we don't want you here. But they couldn't do the jobs. And I went back after 10 years, and I turned the radio on, and the first thing I heard was these expats. I couldn't believe it. Well,
do they call them expats? They don't call them immigrants?
Yes. Nope.
Is that a post-colonial? That's a weird one, isn't it? Migrant workers. Expats always sounds a bit nicer to me than migrant workers or immigrants.
Yeah, no, it was expats.
So everywhere you go,
they're not needed.
Everywhere you go, if you've supported a terrible government, and you're going to bite off the arm of anybody offering you the opportunity to blame it all on foreigners. Blame it all on...
from me.
Jar, that's I like it. Self-editing as well. I'll learn that one, though. Mate, that's a brilliant contribution, but you take my point about you not being... You're an example of some of the things that perhaps Mel Stride is alluding to, but he is not talking. He's categorically not talking about people like you, because you're possessed of all of the attributes that you've just displayed to us that have seen you not only secure jobs in a sector that was previously closed to you, but you're also prepared to schlep halfway around the world in pursuit of professional opportunities. So in many ways, you're the opposite of what Mel Stride is talking about, because it's the people prepared to schlep halfway around the world in pursuit of professional opportunities that he wants to close the door to, and the people who aren't currently working but somehow should be, who are going to fill the gaps created. Holy moly. Up next, less than half of young adults know about D-Day. I don't really do phone-ins based upon the question of so what, but why is that important, if indeed it is, and how might we fix it? 3 minutes after 12 is the time. Very good afternoon to you. Talking about D-Day next, talking about the Second World War. It came up on Mystery Hour on Thursday, which shouldn't be a surprise, should it, given that the 80th anniversary of D-Day unfolds on June the 6th. Most young adults, i.e. a majority of young adults, can't tell you what it was, while 20% believe there's no longer any need to commemorate it or similar events. This is research by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. I've got a couple of questions for you on this. About 2,000 adults were polled, and it was those aged between 18 and 34 who could tell you what D-Day was. I think people, well, I say people, I think when I was younger, I used to have to give my head a little bit of a wobble to remember the distinction between D-Day and Dunkirk. I don't know why I got a kind of glitch on D-Day and Dunkirk, which are the polar opposite experiences, of course. D-Day being the massive invasion, if you like, or the landings in Normandy, and Dunkirk being the evacuation 4 years previously, almost to the day, in fact, when I think about 350,000 British and French soldiers were essentially evacuated from the French port of Dunkirk by anything that could float that people could lay their hands on. So that's one excuse, maybe, but I don't think that a little bit of semantic confusion counts as not knowing. But there is an argument that if it was 80 years ago, then you can forgive young people for not being fully aware of the significance of it. I was born, I think this is really interesting. I nearly said under a wandering star then. I was born in 1972, right? Which means that, what's that? It's 8 to 50, 28 years. I still can't believe that when I say that out loud. 28 years after D-Day. Yes, 28 years is when I was born. And it felt to me growing up almost as far away as Henry VIII. Not as far away as Henry VIII, partly because of films and commando comics and things like that. But it felt like such a distant event. Not just D-Day, but the whole Second World War. And 28 years, that's nothing. What happened 28 years ago? That's not far off Tony Blair becoming Prime Minister. So when I was born, the Second World War was as far back in history as Tony Blair becoming Prime Minister is today. Give or take a few months. Don't be a pedant about it. Isn't that incredible? Because for the very simple reason that Tony Blair becoming Prime Minister feels like yesterday in some sense, whereas when I was growing up, the Second World War felt like it was absolutely yonks ago. Well, I think we'll do this 2 or 3 ways. The first is why the significance of D-Day, why this particular moment in the Second World War should be better remembered than almost any other. All right, so we can start with that for the amateur or indeed professional military historians among us. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Why does D-Day deserve different treatment from all other elements and events of the Second World War? All right, hit the numbers now, you will get through. And then you've got the slightly trickier question of why it's important to commemorate it. Why is it, if that's nice from Ben, 28 years ago was Euro 96, James. That does not feel like it happened in a different era. So why is it important to commemorate? Tell me why you personally, this is a very personal invitation, this part of the phone-in. This is the only bit that I'm going to really limit. Why are you sad? I don't think you should be cross, because it's not really anybody's fault. I suppose education system. But why do you think it's important that young people know what D-Day is or was. All right? 0345 6060 973. Why is it important? People will know that we won the Second World War. They just won't know the details. And what is D-Day, if not a rather large detail of how we won the Second World War? When I did start reading about these matters, I was always more struck by Dunkirk than I was by D-Day. I always thought Dunkirk, because you don't really celebrate retreats or withdrawals, and yet Dunkirk as a national moment was, to my mind, and I'm happy to be dissuaded from this position this hour, but to my mind, it was a more remarkable moment. It was a more extraordinary incident of military history than the Normandy landings themselves. So 2 questions so far. The first is, why is it so important in the context of other moments in the Second World War? Then the second question is, why is it important to commemorate both D-Day and the Second World War in general? Why should young people be growing up with a full understanding of these matters? Eventually you reach a point where it doesn't matter anymore, don't you? I mean, how many people properly understand the role of the British in Ireland, for example, or how many people could talk you through what happened in the Wars of the Roses, or indeed at Agincourt, or in the long series of engagements with the Spanish when Elizabeth I was on the throne? Do you see what I mean? The Boer War, who knows what the Boer War was all about? So there's that kind of historical perspective comes into play as well. So that would be question number 2. And then question number 3, which in a way depends slightly on what your answers are to the first 2 questions. How do you make young people more interested? If you conclude that they should be, and I don't think that's going to be a binary conversation, how do you make them more interested? I tell you what's a remarkable thing. I have a colleague who is not very effusive, as a general rule. I won't embarrass them by telling you of whom I speak, but I have a colleague who's not very effusive, not very excitable. But they found the World War II in colour programmes absolutely transformative. Found them absolutely hypnotising for a number of reasons, not least somehow rendering that footage in colour made it more real. So you would see somebody heading for the front, or you would see somebody preparing to go to war, and you would know that even more so, I guess, in the First World War, but you'd know that the chances of them being dead shortly afterwards were high. You would know that these were people who today would be your colleagues, would be yourself, would be your brother or your dad or your son. And somehow the World War II in colour programmes for my friend brought home the normality of service, which leads us to the question of how you make young people care more or know more. They're 2 quite different things, aren't they? Know more or care more. So question number 1, why D-Day? Why is D-Day so important? I think that might be the least interesting of the 3 questions that I'm asking you this hour, so don't knock yourself out on that one. Question number 2 is why is it important to remember in detail something that happened 80 years ago when, if it was 180 years ago, we would probably all agree that is ancient history now. I didn't say Dunkirk was more significant than D-Day in military terms or in terms of what it did for the context of the Second World War. I said it was more extraordinary. A massive retreat perceived as a tactical success, perceived as a tactical triumph. That's man bites dog territory. The notion of a hugely successful invasion or landing, and that's dog bites man. How do you win wars? Well, by having very successful operations of invasion, pushing enemies back out of territory that they have invaded and conquered. Whereas the notion of a massive retreat being a hugely important military moment is not unique, but it's certainly a heck of a lot rarer than a massive attack being a hugely important military moment. So I'm happy to explain that, but I'm not going to explain it any further. If you still don't understand, that's a you problem, not a me problem. So question number 1, why is D-Day so special? Question number 2, why is it important or sad that young adults don't know what it is? Why is it important to commemorate it more effectively? The incidents of that day, but also the Second World War in general. And then the final question is, how do you do it? How do you make young people more interested in the Second World War? I mentioned being surprised by the proximity of my birth to the Second World War because it did not cast a long shadow over my childhood. That's partly generational, partly familial, I suppose. But it was big in my consciousness in other ways. You know, when we played soldiers, the enemies were Germans. I don't really worry unduly about political correctness, but that's just a matter of historical fact. When we played soldiers, we were British or English, and the Germans were the enemy. When we watched war films, with a few exceptions, there wasn't much room for nuance. The humanity of a German soldier, you might have seen it in the context of the First World War in a play or a film like All Quiet on the Western Front, but otherwise very much portrayed, especially the Second World War, to us as all of the Germans being evil and all of the Brits being plucky heroes. So I had that kind of social/cultural legacy imbued in me through art and fiction, through you know, reconstructions. Like The Great Escape is obviously not fiction, but it's drama. It's very much embellished for the cinema. You had it all there. And that's because I'm 52. If I was 22, it wouldn't have felt relevant to me, and I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. Thank you now for all the people coming out in support of my analysis of Dunkirk being more, if you like, remarkable than D-Day for a whole heap of reasons. Not least because of what it said about the entire population rather than just the army, rather than just the military. Because that idea, there's something I think really magic. I know we're all supposed to hate small boats now, which quite a few of you are pointing out as well. But that idea that ordinary people responded to this call to arms, as Jay in Runcorn puts it. Anyone with anything that could float was doing their bit for the war effort. It was a real case of do first and think later in terms of their bravery. And this is nice. As a primary school teacher, I've taken Year 6 pupils to visit Normandy, to the American, British and German cemeteries, so they could see the enormous loss of life on both sides. They were moved by the experience. It shocks me to think that some young people think it doesn't matter anymore. No one's saying it doesn't matter anymore, just that inevitably it matters less the further away from it you come. But I wonder where the point is for any war at which it doesn't really matter to the majority of the population anymore. 16 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we're examining news that less than half of young adults know about D-Day, and we're wondering why that matters. It's 12:16. It is 12:19. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Milton writes persuasively, I disagree that it matters less with the passage of time, James. In some ways, I think it matters more, so that it never happens again. That's why we need to educate our children on the horrors of World War II. It's a helpful qualification. We're not talking about the Holocaust this hour. I don't think you can teach that too much to people, personally. I don't think that the lessons of the Holocaust can ever be learned too hard. Pertinent, of course, at the moment because of the events that are still unfolding in the Middle East. But you know the ease with which humans can be persuaded to behave with no humanity at all to other humans is a constant presence, I think, in discourse and in human experience. But the details of how a war is won or lost are different, I think, in today's conversation, Milton. I think. I mean, unless you're talking about war being awful. War is stupid, and people are stupid, as someone once sang. But people are stupid, and so war is always going to happen. Why do the details matter? And today, the details of D-Day are front and centre because June the 6th will be the 80th anniversary. Phil's in Chester. Phil, what would you like to say?
Yeah, just from a perspective of being over there in relatively recent times, James, my dad was at D-Day, landed on Sword Beach as part of the 15th Scottish Highlanders, and thankfully survived all the way through. He ended up marching to Belgium and was injured in Belgium and flown back to Britain from there. But his story was the same as many others, that he never really talked about it. Had a really tough time in his 60s, kind of a mini breakdown about the whole thing, and probably other stuff as well. But he then went on to Normandy several times, quite a few times. Very nervous first time they went, and it was I've got a feeling it was the 40th anniversary or the 50th anniversary. I think 50th, I think it probably would have been, of D-Day. And they were partnered up with families, and basically that family looked after them. They met up with a family from just around Caen, where a hell of a lot of fighting happened.
Yes,
Caen was basically flattened.
Yeah.
And they're still friends of ours now, and they are such kind people. And their son, he'd probably be about 8 or 10 when my dad first went over, and he looked after my dad like you wouldn't believe. And my dad died 14 years ago, so that's sort of got by the by. But it's not just him. All the young people and the elderly people, when they saw a veteran in his blazer with his medals on, they were like a hero. They were thanking them.
Well, they are heroes.
Asking them,
but that's the consequence of occupation, isn't it? Though because
what would happen if a veteran walked down the street in the UK, James?
Well, I think there's still quite a degree of reverence and respect. I think we saw that with Captain Tom, didn't we, during the pandemic?
Yeah, maybe so, but not.
But you're not going to have the level of it's not understanding; it's gratitude. That's why I mention occupation. I don't think, because we haven't been successfully invaded since 1066 in this country. Absolutely. And to owe your liberty from Nazism to these identifiable human beings is a very different offer to the one that's being made to young British people. Were it not for men like your dad, you would be living under the Nazi jackboot. We can theoretically speculate on that, and there's some extraordinary counterfactual fiction written in that field. But for French people, it was real. The occupation had happened. They were living under Nazi rule. So I think that actually makes more sense, that you would care more had you been occupied about the liberation than you would if you had not.
Yeah, but it's interesting that I've seen both sides. Because I went out there with my dad and saw Dad in the cemeteries and everything. He met the king.
Cemeteries are chilling, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely just staggering. Chilling. And the World War I are even worse.
Endless.
But that's unbelievable. But then I've now got young children, and we've been out to Normandy on holiday, and the beaches are fantastic beaches. My kids have had such good times on the beaches, particularly Omaha. Omaha is a fantastic place, and it's a great holiday location. But then I sit there, and every few minutes or hours, whatever, you think, "Oh my God, what actually happened?"
I've never been in summer. I've only been. I've never thought of them as having sort of sandcastles and ice cream vans.
Full of people having a great time, and people riding horses and just doing what you would normally do on a holiday. But then you turn behind you, look at the massive cliffs behind you, and think, "Oh my God!"
And there are visitor centres. There are echoes everywhere, much more so. But I think I think that's inevitable. I don't think that's confusing at all. I had never really clocked that before, with the difference, the contrast between being occupied and not being occupied. So if our 18 to 34-year-olds had grown up being taught that their parents and grandparents successfully repelled an invading force, the relationship with the war would be different from the one that people who were never subject to an occupation will have. Why does it matter? Why does D-Day specifically matter, Phil, do you think?
I think because there's a lack of understanding from a hell of a lot of people in the UK as to just what happened. You go to Arromanches, and they've got the Mulberry Harbours there, which are enormous concrete blocks. And these things were made in Conway in North Wales and floated out there, completely oblivious to what the Germans were doing. The effort that went into actually putting this whole thing together under utter secrecy is staggering. It's just
all done under heavy bombardment as well. I mean, the acts of bravery, individual and collective, are worthy of commemoration. And I guess the short answer to the question of why does D-Day matter so much is because it was the biggest ever. It was, it was the biggest ever comparable invasion, transport, deposition of personnel on territory. Phil, thank you. Alexis is in Trowbridge in Wiltshire. Alexis, what would you like to say?
Hi. Sorry if I'm fumbling over my words. I'm a bit nervous.
It's only me. I stumble over my words all the time. Don't worry.
I would say that D-Day in particular matters, just like your last caller said, about the sheer scale of the offensive, because it wouldn't have just been the day, it was all the planning, all the offensive after going into France and into Europe. It was a time where so many countries came together to collaborate, to share information, to do practice, like Americans and North Americans coming to England, taking over a village in Wiltshire, to practice. And so it was sacrifices that people have made, even civilians, and all the sacrifices that all the soldiers took that day. We'd never seen anything like it before.
Largest
really
seaborne invasion in history. I presume it still is, actually. I can't see how it could have possibly been overtaken. But you understand, I mean, what did you study at school? What period of history did you study when you were 12? Can you remember?
I can't remember, I'm afraid, but I think that shows it wasn't
it wasn't this.
Interesting.
We did wattle and daub huts. Did you ever do wattle and daub huts?
I've never heard that in my life.
It was how, Anglo-Saxons, would it, building their own hovels out of wattle and daub. I think we even built, for a project, we had to build our own wattle and daub hut. So it wasn't taught for a while, and I don't think it is taught now. Why should it be taught? Not as a logistical achievement, not as a military logistical achievement, but as something, why I got taught about 1066. I can name the kings post William the Conqueror through to, there's a song, isn't there? So why should it be taught more?
It should be taught because 80 years is not that long. I grew up in Portsmouth, and I was born in 93, but there are still people around who could tell you about it if you took part. And maybe
again, it's proximity, though, isn't it? You're in a military town, a naval town in Portsmouth's case, so proximity to it, as with Phil and French people, particularly in the parts of the world, parts of France where the fighting was fiercest. It's going to have a sense memory. It's going to have a cultural memory. Thank you, Alexis. I like this from Tanya. This is lovely, actually, in Douarnenez. I went to Omaha as well, James, and I saw all the holidaymakers. My first reaction was, how can you frolic on the graves of the heroes? And then I realised that these people having fun on the beach were exactly what the young men had died for. The children's laughter, in many ways, is the greatest memorial. That's beautifully put. It's quite poetic. And I was the same, because I'd never seen the holidaymakers there. In my mind, Omaha is, all of the beaches are Gold, Juno and Sword. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword. All of the beaches are bleak because I've only ever visited them in the middle of winter. But of course, come summer, they're going to have, windbreakers on them and tents and kites and buckets and spades and all the rest of it. It's coming up to 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And it is still, Callum's been in touch, it's still the largest amphibious invasion in military history. It will probably remain like that. I can't quite see how modern warfare would accommodate an event of that nature on that scale. But the question of how you get young people more interested in D-Day in particular, the Second World War in general, is perhaps the hardest one of all. There is clearly work to be done to better engage young people in commemoration efforts, said a spokesperson for I think it is the Director General of the War Graves Commission. So what would that look like, and why is it important? It is just coming up to 12:30. It's time for you to answer either of those questions in all the usual ways. But first, Amelia Cox, how's your headline? 12:33 is the time. I mean, listen, my memory's all over the place as I get older, like a lot of people. But trying to remember what history I was actually taught. I mean, crikey, we had a wonderful teacher who we called the Major, although I think he'd been an RSM in the army. And when he died, and he was called Richard Scott Evans. I honour his memory, actually. He was a lovely man. I had so many dodgy teachers, looking back, that one possessed of genuine kindness, who I think was suffering from shell shock. or a form of PTSD, as we would call it now, but we didn't know at the time. But he was such a lovely man. I was so privileged to know him, let alone be taught for and cared for by him. But when he passed away, another teacher at my prep school wrote an article about his military exploits, and it turned out that he had done truly extraordinary things. I mean, just to balance things out, he wasn't the best history teacher in the world, because all you had to do with the Major, oh God, all you had to do was ask him, if you got the question right early in the class, that was it. It was war stories. For even if he was supposed to be teaching us about the Battle of Hastings, if you got the question right early in the lesson, then with the Major, they were only half an hour, the lesson. So a 15-minute story about some of his memories of or exploits in the war. And as a testament to his modesty, he never gave us any inkling of the stuff that another teacher wrote about after the Major had died. He wrote about it in the school magazine. That was it. You'd get right through to morning break without having to do any lessons at all if you could get the question right about his own experiences. So I had that, but I'm pretty sure that even though he'd seen some serious service in World War II, he never taught us formally about World War II. He was too busy to King Alfred burning the cakes. Do you remember that? Got taught about King Alfred burning the cakes. Got taught about Harold Godwinson getting an arrow in the eye. Did a lot on the Bayeux Tapestry during that period. I think we even went to visit it. Did we go and visit on a school trip? I can't remember. But I don't think we got taught anything about the Second World War. Was that deliberate? For people born in the 1970s, the 50s, the 60s or the 70s? Was it deliberate that we weren't taught about the Second World War? If it was, why? Why weren't we? So I had... did Wattle and Daub huts. I could have told you about Sutton Hoo digging up, was it a Viking ship? It's not that pertinent, is it, to modern Britain? But the Second World War, and I remember studying the Holocaust, but I think we did that in a sort of ethics RE type context rather than a history context. Was it? Because if it was deliberate, I can't quite, unless we were trying to put it all behind us and move on. Probably a little unfair to bring Brexit into this conversation, but I tried to bring it into absolutely everything. An awful lot of the, what you might call the more sensible, that's not quite the right word either, is it? An awful lot of the more patrician support for Brexit from the older generation came from a legacy of the Second World War. I mean, people who'd literally lost their fathers in the Second World War had a relationship with European integration, particularly when Germany was perceived as having a position of power and influence. A lot of people were deeply troubled by that, whether they could articulate it or not. I think that it's true. So all of that perhaps explains why there wasn't a particular appetite to immerse children in it at school in the decades that immediately followed the cessation of hostilities. 12:37 is the time. Max is in Cambridge. Max, what would you like to say?
Hi, I thought I would like to give input as a young person who's interested in like D-Day and World War II and such.
Oh yeah.
So
how young are you? Actually, I need to establish your credentials. 18, that'll do. That's young. I think that's about as young as you're allowed to be without your parents' permission, Max. So fill your boots.
I think a lot of the reason why young people aren't knowledgeable or interested is because it's being censored from the internet.
Really?
And social media, purely through the fact that it's an event where just so many people died, and it's such a unfamily friendly event. And so, like, people on TikTok, you'll see it all the time, just censor every word that possibly could be construed as bad.
What do you mean by people censor every? Because I see lots of stuff that
creators.
Right, you're in danger of losing me a little bit on this. So if I put something on TikTok about, or let's just say that it's Phil in Chester putting something up about his dad's experiences on D-Day, who censors that?
Well, it'll get censored in the algorithm if it contains words like death, kill.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Things like that. So people censor themselves so that they can be seen.
Right.
And how are you meant to talk about D-Day without showing pictures of possibly people with dead bodies?
Okay.
Talking about the deaths and stuff like that.
Yeah, okay. I mean, this is where the gulf in our ages, I think, becomes pertinent, Max. It becomes so because I was about to poo-poo the idea that if you're 18 and you're not getting it on TikTok, then you're not going to get it at all. But I suspect there's probably some truth in that.
Yeah. The only reason why my dad would make us watch World War II in colour and shows like that, and so on TV, obviously, you can be a bit more, especially on like the History Channel and stuff. You can be a lot more free with what you show, and
yeah, I guess so. I mean, you may be onto something, you may not, but it's your experience, so it's valid and it's relevant. What is the importance of it? What does an 18-year-old who knows quite a lot about the Second World War have that an 18-year-old in this country doesn't have? What is the value? What's the thing of value that you possess? Do you think?
You see how badly the world can quickly go.
See that.
And we're never too far from. It's a bit of a pessimistic view, but it's probably a useful pessimistic view.
The fragility of civilization.
Yeah, and how all of a sudden you can have in 6 years 80 million people be killed.
Yeah, the fragility of peace.
Yes, and it's obviously a warning. You hear that
does
a lot.
It work, though? Because I agree with you about the importance of it, but I also think that the further you get from, and I bring the Holocaust into it for the purposes of this bit of the conversation, because it would be remiss not to, the further you get from it, even if you're taught it, the harder it is to feel it. The rise of the far right across Europe is probably a consequence of the amount of time that has passed since the last time we saw what happened when the far right was on the rise across Europe. But can you stop that? Attrition? Can you stop that process with more education? This is how Hitler came to power. This is what he did.
I've been to Auschwitz, and it's really quite horrific.
Yeah, I haven't been.
And I was basically silent throughout the entire thing. And I think everybody should go to and visit a concentration camp, because that's sort of how you do it. And obviously with COVID, there's been less trips around the world to.
So it resonates in a way that a book or even a film or a postcard. I've not been to Auschwitz. I've been to Anne Frank's house in Amsterdam, and that absolutely threw me. I don't know why, but it is that imagining another human in the situation they were in, and imagining it was you. That's almost the definition of empathy, isn't it? Is that it could happen here. It could happen at any time.
And you have to be quite a sociopath to not just feel awful walking through Auschwitz.
Yeah, and that Max, thank you. That was, yeah. I mean, a few people are picking you up on social media comments because of what we see coming out of Gaza. But I guess it depends on algorithms and it depends on individual experiences. But the lesson of the Holocaust, perhaps, I don't know, foolishly, I can separate from the lessons of beating the people responsible for the Holocaust. That's why the commemoration of D-Day probably becomes a bigger issue in the minds of young people if you link it inexorably to the vanquishing of the architects of the Holocaust. So it ceases to be a military moment of logistical genius and instead becomes part of the process of stopping the greatest act of inhumanity that we will hopefully see in a period of 200 years or 500 years. 1243 nearly is the time. Jim's in Whitley Bay. Jim, what would you like to say?
It's about how you turn kids on to appreciating things like D-Day.
Yeah.
I retired 15 years ago, but prior to retiring, the school I was at had an activities week on the penultimate week of the summer term. And basically, teachers decided what some experience they would do with children. The children signed up. Yeah. There was no sort of compulsion. They could choose what they wanted to do. And I organised a week's trip to Normandy to do the beaches and the sites, staying at a municipal campsite in Falaise. So we had a sort of an outdoor experience. They were looking after themselves. And we were also being educated about the D-Day landings and things like that.
How did it affect the kids? How did it affect the lads?
Right. The last night, they were in tears, not wanting to go home.
Really?
Really, one or two of them, they'd had such a traumatic experience.
Why? Because they got chapter and verse on what had happened, and they could imagine it being them in a bit older, in a different
exactly.
era. Yeah,
they were there. You know that scene in Saving Private Ryan when Tom Hanks goes into the graveyard at the beginning and looks around at Col de Saint-Laurent, the American graveyard, with the Stars of David and the crosses, and they're all perfectly aligned. And as you turn round, they all become in line. There's Ridley Scott, of course, but that is exactly what we experienced when we were there. It was that sort of, shock to the system with your eyes. Apart from things like Pegasus Bridge.
Yes.
Pegasus Bridge was the first. Yeah, well, we ran across Pegasus Bridge because that was the first place that the paratroopers landed with gliders to try and stop any Germans advancing on the beaches once it landed. And next to it, they were the first soldiers to be killed on D-Day. And they're buried in the churchyard at Ranville, which is next door. And we were visiting the graves, and we saw this English couple there. And we got talking to them, and it transpired that the lady had married a soldier a week before he was killed at Pegasus Bridge.
Really?
And her husband had promised to take her to the grave. And we sat there listening to this sort of this account, and we were totally moved. Really, it was just things like that. It's little things. The paratrooper on Sam Mary Glee's roof with the parachute is still there. But not
I've seen that as well. I mean, there's so much history around there. But I think, I think Phil was the first caller. It's because it's their history. It's not. It is. It's not obviously our history, is it? Until you meet someone like the woman you describe, or because we went there, we did it, we came back. They're still there. Yeah. The people in Normandy, the people so they're going to have. It's not better or worse, but it's different. They're going to have a different relationship. Jim, thank you.
They do.
Thank you. You've taken me right up to the wire, but that resonates. I don't know if you've ever seen. I know Jim has. I don't know if you've ever seen that parachuter sort of suspended from the side of the church. I don't know why some things stick with you and other things don't. For me, it was Otto Frank, not Anne Frank. It was because Otto Frank went back, and the photograph of him back in the attic, having survived the Holocaust when the rest of his family didn't. That I think, because I was with my kids and they were young, this stuff gets you. But Max was right, wasn't he? The importance of it is double. It's not the commemoration of the victory, but the remembrance of what defeat would have meant and what had already happened. It's 12:47. Good Lord, it's 10 to 1 already. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I talk about adoption on the programme for two main reasons. Number one, I'm adopted. It's a subject of huge importance to me, always has been. And number two, not a million miles away from some of the conversation we've been having for the rest of this hour. Perspective really matters. My understanding of adoption is based upon my experiences that began in 1972. It has almost nothing to do with the modern experience of adoption. The modern experience of adoption will see usually children with very particular needs becoming available for adoption because of traumatic early years or early months, and the change in law and outlook in the Republic of Ireland means that the mothers that were bussed or shipped over here to give birth, give up their babies and go home, babies like me, did not have medical issues. And so one of the reasons I return to this subject again and again and again is to help spread the understanding of the challenges that adoptive families face today, which are a million miles away from what adoptive families like mine faced in the 1970s and to a lesser extent the 1980s. And the figures that Adoption UK has published today are pretty chilling. It's part of their annual Adoption Barometer report, and it shows that the number of adoptive families in England facing severe challenges or at crisis point has increased in a single year from 30% to 38%, and the number who are optimistic about their future has fallen by 9%. I've got adopted grandsons who had very difficult starts in life, and I know quite a lot about how hard it is to access the sort of support and help that you need. And nonetheless, I'm very grateful to Anya Sizer for joining me today. Anya and her husband adopted their son when he was 15 months old, and he's now 12. I hope my analysis of the different experiences that you would have compared to, say, my parents was accurate, Anya. But how do you mark the decline in support and service that has apparently unfolded in recent years? How do you account for this rise in families describing themselves as being at a crisis point, rising exponentially in just the last 12 months?
Well, it's certainly the situation that I see on the ground, and it certainly was our situation, is our situation, that adoption remains an amazing thing to do, and we don't have any regrets about it at all, but it is certainly the hardest thing that we've ever had to face, and I know that most adoptive families would say that. I think it comes with such a range of complexities, and the children have such diverse and huge needs a lot of the time. And unless the infrastructure is there to support families and to support these children, we're sort of doing the whole topic of adoption a great disservice.
Yes. Can you tell me a little about your own son's complex needs?
Absolutely. So we love him dearly, but our son was born with a condition called fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which means that he was exposed to alcohol in the womb. And it's a lifelong disability. It's a lifelong situation that they're having to deal with, and the families are dealing with. And it can present with a huge range of complexities, from emotional development to physiological development and everything in between. It's unfortunately quite common now with adoption.
Yes.
And so he was born with FASD and also has ADHD. And it means that parenting, and we have parented before, we have 2 birth children, it means that parenting is very, very different for an adoptive child. And it's been very, very testing.
And can I ask you a silly, well, I hope it's not a silly question. It is a silly question, isn't it? Because, of course, if you had a biological child with FASD, the entire situation would be different. But perhaps leaving aside that very specific condition and looking instead at ADHD and other special educational needs, is there a different level of service for adoptive families compared to biological families, or are you all in the same sort of boat together, despite the fact that an adoptive family is more likely to face these sort of issues?
Well, I think that's one of the big issues, is there really has to be a wake-up call that this is the norm rather than not.
Yes.
I think there's a few things that you can access in a way. So there's the Adoption Support Fund. There's amazing organisations such as Adoption UK that are there to support. But a lot of the time it is you are part of the same system. And unfortunately, the system is just not really set up enough to provide the care and support that we all need. And it shows on the ground, and it shows in this year's barometer.
Do you think that's partly because of people like me, because of the experience of successfully adopting a baby and then never hearing from the adoption agency again and not particularly wanting to? There's a sort of cultural legacy of thinking that adoption ends at the moment of handover, whereas in fact for your generation of adoptive families, it's a completely different experience.
So there's 2 things with that. One, definitely there are always a lot of myths around adoption. There's a lot of false impressions about what adoption is and isn't, and it's in the sort of DNA of our society about
yes, it is, isn't it?
Around adoption. But you're absolutely right that we need to be, really focusing in on the realities of it, and who are the children that are there and what are their actual needs rather than perceived needs. And once we can get our heads around that and get the support and finances in place, then adoption can be an amazing option and a great thing. But the reality is most children today will come with a level of trauma, and many will come with additional needs. And so we need to have that support as default rather than exceptional.
It's such a tightrope, isn't it? Because you know the top priority is finding a forever home for the children. So you can understand how perhaps some attention is either consciously or subconsciously directed away from the potential problems. You're trying to help parents go through the adoption process. Some people listening to this might be put off by some of the things that you've said from going down that path, and that's the last thing on earth that you want to achieve. And yet, if you continue to keep these issues in the dark and you continue to not properly highlight them, then the worst case scenarios are more likely to unfold, where adoptions actually fail.
Yeah, we have to be realistic, but we have to be optimistic as well. You know, we don't regret for a moment adopting our son. We love him dearly.
Of course you do.
But neither do we underplay just how difficult it's been and just the level of complexities that we were ill prepared for and still remain underprepared for. But I think the phrase that you've just used is the key one. It's a forever family that we're looking for, not just placement.
Yes.
And so there has to be structures in place to support a family forever to thrive.
You're great, Anya. It's really good that you find the time and the motivation to do this when, you know, like all of us, you've got your own family and your own life to be getting on with, because you're sort of thinking about people who not many other people think about, aren't you?
Well, you know, some days we lose sight of all of that, but we don't regret it for a moment. It just needs more support. That's the bottom line.
And the first step towards that destination is getting more light onto the issue and talking about it more, which you've helped me do today. So I'm very grateful to you, Anya Sizer. It is coming up to 12:59. You have been listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where you can, of course, if you missed any of today's show, listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, our official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Ben Kentish is standing in for Tom Swarbrick today at 4 o'clock, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 Now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.